Well, we are officially starting our very first NCA education webinar, and I am your host today, Dave Munt from Lake Shasta Caverns, otherwise known as Cave Dave. And so I want to welcome those of you that joined because NCA Education Committee, we always want to try to bring our member caves the best that we can in terms of what's going on in the world of caving and karst and all that fun stuff that goes along with it. And so we decided to do some webinars that we can actually see people outside of our organization that can bring a wealth of information into our organization. And so today on our very first webinar, we're honored to have Dr. Will White with us. And Will, thank you for joining. It's an honor to have you. Glad you're here.
I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah, so highlighting a few of your accomplishments, you're the executive vice president, I believe, still of the Karst Waters Institute.
Yep, that's correct.
And you've been doing that how long now?
Well, we founded the Karst Waters Institute in 1991. I've been on their board of directors since day one.
Nice. Well, we'll get to that in a little bit because we do want to hear more about that. But you also have a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry, and you have a PhD from Penn State in Geochemistry. And you actually served 40 years on the Penn State faculty.
Yep, that's correct. All 40 of them.
And Will, I am willing to bet right now that none of your students ever played a joke on you.
No, well, I'm not quite sure. We actually had some football players in the geology department. They were pretty good. They work well out in the field. They're trained. They're physically strong. They can deal with field work.
There you go. I knew that would come in handy, right? Having
Yeah.
those big football players. So you have written, and I was astounded by this fact, about 400 technical articles and published in various journals.
Well, it's 400 and I don't know, 40 technical articles, about 130 of which deal with caves and karst.
That's amazing. I told my wife last night about these accomplishments, and she said, caves and what? So I had to tell her about karst. And then we started talking about speleogenesis and hypogene caves and epigene caves. And then I realized she'd fallen asleep about 10 minutes before I even started talking. But I did read about 100 of those papers in preparation for our hour together. Well, okay, maybe not.
That would take some pretty careful doing, yeah.
But we do want to get to talking about the book you wrote in just a few minutes. I have my copy here, and I think it's a really great little book. But before we get to that, Will, you know, we always love stories. And I found that in our caving community, people tell stories more than just about any other type of community or organization I've ever belonged to. So tell us a story, Will. Tell us about maybe your first cave experience, how that came to be.
That's, I can't remember a time when I wasn't interested in caves, as I used to go wandering off into the woods as a little kid looking for caves. But I heard my dad and his buddies good at telling some hunting stories. They mentioned a place called the Panther Caves. Oh, wow, okay, got to go find it. I got a few instructions, and we headed off through the woods for a couple of miles, and sure enough, there's a little group of tectonic caves down on the banks of Lake Racetown, central Pennsylvania. And we spent a lot of time when on my grade school and high school years scratching out these 20-foot long, 30-foot long caves that had formed in the cracks where this big piece of the cliff had slid away. But it was some years before I really started caving seriously. When I was in college, I had a summer job no less of a place than Lincoln Caverns as a cave guide.
I've heard of that place.
And then we often started locating caves around central Pennsylvania and exploring those. And it's gone on by the time I don't know, finished college or a year or two later, I had something like 150 caves on the list that I had looked at. But somewhere in there, after, well, it was really after I left Juniata College, but it was on my first job at the Mellon Institute of Industrial Research in Pittsburgh. I started getting more interested in the science of caves than I was in just crawling around in the mud. And so I saw fewer caves, but I saw them in a lot more detail than I would have paid attention to earlier. And it's gone on from there. I eventually got my PhD from Penn State, got invited to join the faculty, which is nice because I didn't have to hunt for a job. And went set up a sort of a research group there. There was almost no one doing research on caves back. This would have been late 1960s. And people just didn't think cave science or cave research was anything that a serious geologist ought to be doing. Attracted some students that came who were interested in caves too, regardless of what their professors thought. And went on from there. So it generated something like 18, I think, MS and PhD theses of students who did their research work on caves. And set up a course on the geology of caves and karst that I taught for 30 years until I retired. But I've got the same problem you guys had a few minutes ago. I would get a phone call from a prospective student that would say, I'm really interested in your course on caves, but please, what is karst? Well, I got done with the course, I knew what karst was.
Yeah, it's always fun educating our tour guides at Lake Shasta Caverns too about karst. They remember stalactites and drippy, pointy things, but once we start talking about karst, I continually have to reinforce what that means. And that's a good segue, Will, into the Karst Waters Institute. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the Karst Waters Institute is a volunteer organization of mostly academics. Most of the people involved at the Institute are at universities someplace or another, and they're mostly universities where they have some kind of a research program on caves and karst. And the idea was, and that, well, we started out with the idea of building an actual brick and mortar institute, but never was able to find the kind of money you need to do something like that. I started instead trying to say, well, let's see if we can get the karst community together, so people know what each other is doing. And so we started running these essentially scientific conferences. And first one was in 1994 in Colorado Springs, where we were talking about the influence of microorganisms in cave, the microbiology. And I think that may have been one of the first times anybody actually talked about that. Turns out there was some very interesting things going on. I had the interesting task of trying to explain whether or not the science of thermodynamics works when the bugs are in there, which I've still not entirely made up my mind about. But we've been on, there's been about 20 some of these conferences. There's one coming up in November on the Appalachians, Appalachian karst. There was one back a few years ago held in Puerto Rico on contaminant transport in caves and the interaction between groundwater contamination and public health.
So when you said a term that really I keyed in on, you said the karst community. And we talk about caving community and karst community, how can we work together to join those terms? Because I know some people obviously don't get the term karst as much as perhaps they should. And do you sense this? Is there a karst community that perceives a caving community as perhaps kind of weirdos out there in black holes? Or uh, is there kind of a mutual Venn diagram where we all intersect in harmony?
It's never been a bunch of weirdos among ourselves. Other people may have thought that,
Mhm.
with good reason in some cases. But now we have biologists who are interested in the organisms in caves. We've got a variety of bat experts. We've got hydrogeologists interested in the movement of water through carbonate terrain, some
Right.
geochemists, some traditional geologists, geomorphologist types, but they're mostly scientists. This is the thing. The caving community is people who explore caves, which includes a lot of cave explorers and sport cavers. And you have your community of show cave operators, which have certain things in common that other cavers would not necessarily be interested in.
Right.
But the cave and karst community as I deal with it, are mostly academics of one sort or another.
And what kind of contributions can the academic community help show cave operators with?
Well, personally, I think show caves are wonderful places. It's nice to be able to see the cave when you turn the lights on. But, the number of show caves have been used for scientific study because, among other things, it's a very good chance for a cooperative arrangement because somebody who wants to make measurements over a long period of time would sort of advance beyond this wander through the cave and take some pictures and take some notes and go back out again. It's now, what's going on in the cave, and you've got to watch water dripping or measure the chemistry of water or something over long, continuously over long time periods. And showcase make an excellent place to set up that kind of research because you're reasonably certain that somebody isn't going to come by and walk off with your equipment, for example.
Yeah, we at Lake Shasta Caverns, we cooperate with quite a number of scientists that have contributed to our understanding of our cave over the years. And we had set up some scientific indicators in one of our rooms, and it just was out of reach of the trail. And one of our guests actually climbed out of over the railing and grabbed it and broke it. So that's always the risk. We were so disappointed, but what do you do? Keep studying.
I had a PhD student working in Mammoth Cave National Park, figuring, okay, it's a national park, and I've got uniformed rangers carrying firearms to look after my equipment. And so we had this sensor embedded in one of the big springs that drains the water from Mammoth Cave. We were making a continuous record of the water chemistry. So there's this package of instruments that's down in the spring, but then the recording package is up on the bank. And so you got to connect them. And there's this great cable coming up out of the water and going up through the woods to where the recording package was stuck away under a ledge. Sure enough, fishermen come by and says, "Oh, what's that?" And they pull the thing out of the river and said, "Obviously not a fish," and they throw it back in again. Kind of messed up our recording record.
So Bob, having heard these stories, maybe the NCA can purchase guns that we can all carry to guard our scientific experiments. We can table that for now, but bring it up later. Will, let's talk a little bit about your book now. It's a great little book. I have my own copy, as I mentioned, and What led you to contribute to this book? Obviously, you know a lot more than what went into this book, but what was your vision, and did you accomplish what you wanted when you saw the final printed form?
Well, let me try to answer all of those questions. The KWI, Karst Waters Institute, decided to go, in some new directions. We published these various proceedings and these conferences, which are very weighty, scientific, therefore basically boring documents. And maybe we should publish something that's more suitable for just the public in general, which is, of course, your customers or your business.
Mhm.
And so I pipe up. I can't seem to keep my mouth shut when I should. And say, well, one that would be popular would be speleothems. And another might be cave mineralogy. And there was already a couple of these little books dealing with recognizing cave organisms. This is not the first such book. There are several others, but written by the biologists.
Mhm.
Okay, so all right, well, as usual, you open your mouth and say, that's a great idea, Will, why don't you do it? And so I, okay. And I sat down and sketched out an outline and sketched out some text. And about 3/4 of the pictures in that book are my own photographs. Few of them are from my co-authors and some are from other people. But puts this stuff together and started passing it together. Then we sort of fiddled around. Remember, this is a group of academics, and we do have other things on our plate. And fiddled around for a long time before we finally got it together. Then finally said, well, okay, now how do we publish it? And so we look around and say, well, got some quotes from a printer, and geez, that's going to be really expensive because if we want to sell these at showcase, you guys are going to want to sell them for a rather modest price because nobody's going to buy them.
Sure.
And okay, so this is kind of two ends of the rope that you can't quite tie together. So eventually we got a grant from the Cave Conservancy of the Virginias
Fantastic.
to underwrite a good portion of the printing costs. So we were able to produce that thing in the form you see it. Now, do I like it? Not entirely, because we wanted to print it on really heavy paper that could be carried around in a cave.
Right.
And it turns out that, well, they looked at the cost. I'm not sure. Somebody dropped a ball somewhere. And so it's printed on a nice shiny paper, but it'll take dropping it in the puddle, but it won't take carrying it through the mud.
Okay. Well, I think it's valuable with the comb binding. I like that binding because it can lay flat rather than perhaps just kind of the binding breaking easily. And it is a handy size to take into a cave. Uh, One of the things that I plan to do with it is in my local grotto, we're always recruiting new members. And I think this would be an excellent thing to, I don't know, maybe include in our membership price, which in my grotto, it's really super high. And I don't know what you guys all charge for memberships in grottos if you're in one, but our grotto is $5 a year.
Ah,
Yeah,
So,
what's it be? A little more than that.
not much.
Yeah, not much.
but maybe this would be a nice gift for someone that commits to a year or two in a grotto, or just to recommend to a brand new caver. But Will, you did say something earlier about the 1960s. So at that time, there were no cavers that existed at all in the world. If I recall, there were only potholers in Europe and spelunkers in the United States. And,
Yeah.
and then all of a sudden, there were cavers.
Yep.
So yeah, I know it's kind of an inside joke, but tell us about spelunkers and cavers.
Well, in the current sociology of things, the phrase is cavers rescue spelunkers. And the word spelunker has now gone from essentially a synonym for caver, which was the way the original NSS people thought it was. And it's become it's kind of a pejorative name for people who go in caves completely unprepared. I got one flashlight with weak batteries. They don't know where they're going. They can't keep track and they can't find their way back out again. And so sooner or later, you've got to call the cave rescue people, and they go in and find them sitting in the dark in there someplace trying to share a candy bar 5 ways and haul them out of the cave.
Have you ever had to be involved in a cave rescue?
A couple of times, yeah.
And hopefully they all turned out well.
Well, the one that I was most involved with, fortunately, turned out quite well. This was a cave in Penns Valley in Pennsylvania, has an 80-foot entrance pit. And one caver rappelled down, and he made a mistake. He said off rope, when he wasn't really off rope. He was still sitting at the bottom of the pit, getting himself entangled. So the next caver started down, knocked the loose rock off, which came whistling down, and very neatly broke this fellow's shin bone
Oh,
from the rock. So anyway, fortunately, there was one of the cavers was a nurse. So she splitted up his broken leg using a rappel rack for a splint. And one of them climbed back out of the cave, called, and I had a student who was just finishing up and was getting ready to leave and stopped by. We were talking, and when the phone rang with his rescue call came in, he had already emptied out his van. I was getting ready to move. So we jumped in his van, drove to the cave, a couple other people, dropped the rope down, hauled this guy out, put him laid him out on the back of the van, and had him in the emergency room within an hour, probably, at the time he broke his leg. And people in the emergency room had never seen anything quite like that show up at the door, but fitted up his leg, bang, it came out, he's fine, and everything worked out. My wife and I were on the call down list for cave rescue for many years.
mm-hmm.
And usually the call would usually come in about 2 o'clock in the morning. And so went caving and they haven't come home. All right, where did they go? I don't know, they didn't tell me. And I think it was somewhere out in western Pennsylvania. And I'm thinking, all right. If it's in western Pennsylvania, there's probably one cave out there called Bear Cave, is the one that everybody goes to who doesn't know anything. And so I call up some cavers out there, and somebody gets up 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning and drives over to the Bear Cave parking lot, and no sign of any cave. So we're getting ready to rouse people out to start searching all the caves around the place. And finally, about 7 o'clock in the morning, the call comes up from this terrified mother and says, nah, she's home. And it turns out that what they had done is snuck off to go to North Carolina for the weekend and didn't want to tell their parents. So they said they were going caving. But cave rescue is a serious business. Getting a person who's bad hurt out of a cave.
Yeah.
Very, very complicated operation. I've only ever worked around the perimeter of the problem. I'm not deep into it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One more question about the book. Do you think it'll be reprinted on the stock of the paper that you originally had desired?
If we reprint it, I'd like to put it on a heavier stock. Yeah. I think we may be able to do that. Depends on how the thing goes. I think the first print run was about 1,000 copies or something like 2,000. 2,000, Ann says. And
Nikki says.
That'll take a while.
Yeah. By the way, Emily Davis said hello. She asked me to pass along her greetings.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Yes, I know Emily very well.
Yeah, so obviously I got the book through Speleobooks. Is there any other place that you can get it from? Is it on online on Amazon or anything?
Not that I know of.
Okay, yeah. Um, you have authored or co-authored 17 other books. Is that correct?
That's the number I tell people.
And you will neither confirm nor deny the truth of that.
Well, it's all in what you call a book. And
Uh-huh.
the thing that you're holding, I probably will not call a book.
Yeah, yeah.
So, I mean, it's a document, it's in a category of material, which I've written a number of, called educational materials.
Hmm.
You know, it's not scientifically deep enough to really justify calling it a book.
Well, that's a really good point because I suppose there is a tipping point somewhere where the detail, the information just becomes a little too detailed for maybe the general public, and now you're into more of a specialist realm. Academia would be the proper audience.
Yeah, my co-author on that volume is Sarah Carmichael from Appalachian State University down in North Carolina. She's, I'm glad I didn't have to write any term papers for her because she really worked over that manuscript and said, no, no, you can't say that. People won't know what you're talking about.
So it had to go through a little bit of editing to make it more accessible.
Now, the two other people's names certainly did their part of going through and filling in, and I wrote most of the text as a starting point, but
Uh-huh.
I got worked over by the others. So
Yeah. So are any of the other books or projects that you have cooperated with on or collaborated with would be the better term, uh, are they of a nature that perhaps someone in a general population could benefit from them?
one of the books is a textbook on
Uh-huh.
caves, pretty badly outdated now. It was written in 1988, but it was written for undergraduates at
Mm.
the college level.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, it's got some, you know, it's got some technical things in it, mostly dealing with the chemistry and with the dynamics of flowing water and things like that. But a lot of it is descriptive. So if you want to look at, you want to know what various kinds of sinkholes and things are, I would tell you.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably the closest. I
Mm-hmm.
wrote a document on the geology of caves, the Pennsylvania Geological Survey, even earlier, and
Mm-hmm.
they published it as one of their general geology series. I
Mm-hmm.
think is out of print and has been out of print for quite a while. But it's also an introduction to the geology of caves, but from a considerably more elementary point of view.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning I don't have a lot of chemical equations and stuff.
Thank God for that, right? Um, so, so Will, obviously all of us showcase have tour guides. Uh, if you were to say, fly out to California and sit down with me and look at my tour guide script, pick it apart, what are some of the maybe three keys to a successful tour guide script that you could think of from your perspective? Two or
Oh,
three
boy.
things.
Been a long time since I've done that. But, well, I guess not really. Ann and I took the board of directors of the NSS through Lincoln Caverns a couple years ago.
Mhm.
I'm back being a cave guide again, but the I think to emphasize a lot of the showcase that I've gone to over the years, but particularly years and years ago, like back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, when I made it a point to try to visit as many of the showcase as I could get to,
Hmm.
is that a lot of the guides sounded like a rusty tape recording.
Mhm.
They have a script, they memorize the script, and they repeat the script. And I found it was a lot better if you just talk to people
Hmm.
and you figure out, okay, what's this person interested in? You know, some people are really interested in the cave. Some
Uh-huh.
people are interested in stories about the caves. Some people don't really give a damn about the cave, but they've got wrestled into going through it anyway. So the trick is how to get these guys thinking, interested in your cave and what it says and why it might be interesting for them to take a close look at it. But that's one. It's good
So it
to
kind
have
of
scientific
stay,
base.
staying on that point then, it sounds like we're looking for like a point of engagement where a tour guide needs to be able to discern what it is in his or her particular group that's going to catch them and help them be sticky to the tour.
Yeah, well, if they can learn to do that, they will learn something that will be very helpful to them, whatever they do in later life.
Ah,
Particularly if they decide to be teachers, professors, something like that.
uh-huh.
I have a tale that I've told about being a cave guide, which is, you know, you got a small party of four stops in. There's Pa. He's still grumbling about the price of the tickets. He didn't want to stop in the first place. You know, there's Ma. She is sure that this place is just crawling with snakes. There's a
Mhm.
little guy who's afraid of the dark. Fortunately, you've got a teenager who thinks a cave is wonderful. If you could just pull all those people together and make them think they've had a wonderful experience, you have earned your pay as a guide.
And right there is worth this whole hour with you, Will. I love that. I love that. That's so good. But and I'm sorry I did cut you off, but you were about to tell us one more thing, I think. Um, and I cut you off, so now I'm not sure if we can recover that
I'm
train
not
of thought.
sure I can recover because I'm not sure what I was starting to say. I haven't got that far into it. But
Things you recommend for a cave guide.
Things that you recommend a cave guide do
yeah,
or use on their tour.
yeah. Yeah, what was the third one? Oh, another thing your cave guide should know is at least the basics of the geology of the cave and
Mhm.
the biology of the cave. What kind of critters live in the cave? Why are they important? Now, like what bats, for instance, which are very important species, which everybody, I think most of the show caves now are well aware of that. And
Mhm.
the notion about water moving through the cave, that water moving through big holes in the ground can be very contaminated. You've got to be very careful of that. Just the notion of what the minerals are, what the geology is, how the cave formed, you know, not necessarily at a highly technical level, but the way you would explain it to school kids.
Mhm. Yeah.
Might be worthwhile for them to know some of the actual scientific advances that have come out of cave science in the last few years or so.
Yeah, we just found out about 4 years ago that Lake Shasta Caverns is a hypogenic cave. We believed for most of our tour life as a show cave that was epigenic. Uh, when did the understanding of hypogenic processes first kind of arrive in the scientific front?
People have raised the issue of whether or not sulfuric acid rather than carbonic acid might play a role in cave development, but the sort of the initial concept of the hypogenetic model for cave development, very late probably in the 1990s, early 2000s. It's only been 20 or 30 years. We started to understand, be able to write down a chemical model and try to understand something about how these things might work. I think it was about late 1980s Carol Hill wrote a big treatise on Carlsbad Caverns that really developed the ideas in considerable detail.
Mhm.
Ideas have been floating around. They have been floating around in the Russian literature for a while, but not in a very systematic way. You know, it's basically distinguishing between epigenetic, which is a fancy word for meaning from top down, and
Mhm.
hypogenetic, which is another fancy word for bottom up. And we've got some kind of deep-seated fluids coming from somewhere, coming through and somehow undergo a reaction that causes them to dissolve limestone and make a cave. But it's a very popular subject now. There's a lot of literature on it.
I think what that tells us is, if that's only been around since the 1990s or so, that science is so exciting because we're going to learn more as the years go by, and just discover perhaps new ways of thinking about our cave development and how it came to be about, and perhaps even more about the ecosystem of caves. And that, I think that's really exciting to all of us.
What is probably the hottest subject right now, certainly in terms of generating the most scientific papers, is the use of cave speleothems, mostly stalagmites, as climatic records.
Mhm.
My colleague at Penn State is a glaciologist. He wrote a book about glaciers called the 2 Mile Time Machine. I could write a book about caves that would talk about the 5 million year time machine. But take a nice, fresh, obviously growing broom handle stalagmite that's maybe 5, 6 feet high,
Mhm.
and you have got a record of what the rainwater was like going all the way back through the last couple ice ages. And unfortunately, you've got to sacrifice the stalagmite to find out what it is. So people are trying to be pretty careful about this. Slice the thing lengthwise, and you'll see it's made up of layers that have been growing and growing for several million years in some cases, tens of thousands of years in other cases. And you analyze these layers, look at the trace elements that are in there, look at the oxygen and carbon isotopes that's in the calcite, that's in the stalagmite, and you find these vary from layer to layer. And if you can just figure out how to read the signal, it's telling you, okay, we had grassland up there on top of the cave back 10,000 years ago. And you can get exact dates on these things because you can look at the thorium uranium isotopes, traces of thorium, traces of uranium in the stalagmite. And from that, you can get an exact age for each layer. And so now I know from the oxygen and carbon, I know it was grassland. And from the uranium thorium date, I know that it was 130,000 years ago, back in the last interglacial. I've learned something about what happened, and people are going big time. To get the signal, we got beautiful signals. It's like having a book written in a strange language with a strange alphabet. And you know the book contains a lot of stuff you want to know, but you can't figure out how to read it.
That's a beautiful analogy. I love that. A record of climate data. Yeah. So Will, what advice would you give to young people that are coming up in the field of the scientific disciplines that you're involved with? Is there anything you would have done differently, knowing what you know now?
No, I still don't know what I'm doing, so it's pretty hard. But the geological sciences have expanded their scope. We've got climate and climate problems. We've got groundwater problems, we've got all sorts of environmental problems, all works together. It's a wonderful field to be in. And you can do things that are a lot of fun to do, and you might actually be doing your fellow citizens some good by doing it. So.
All right. Well, I'd like to give some of our other participants in this call the opportunity to ask you a question as well. We're kind of winding it down now. So are there any questions from anyone in our audience?
Well, I don't have a question, but I have a statement that I'd like to make. And I have a copy of Will's book here that Emily and Mike gave me. And the good news is that for our upcoming convention, Speleobooks will be giving one book to every cave that is in attendance at convention this year.
I didn't know that.
Fantastic.
That's wonderful.
Well, that's great, Bob.
And of course, as I said to Emily, this certainly will generate some sales from our caves. They'll have one right in their hot little hand, and it's nothing like having a tangible item, just like a brochure.
Wonderful.
That's wonderful. Thanks for sharing that, Bob.
Sure.
So I will offer what I did. Of course, we are fortunate enough to have Will join us for our May staff meeting. That's happened for many years, and you know, give some advice about caves and cave science to our staff. So this past year, of course, the book was relatively new. We have them in our gift shop, but I bought a copy for each staff member that was at that meeting, so they have that as a reference.
It's great.
Yeah, any other questions or comments?
Yep. No question.
Oh. Okay.
Could you flip? I don't have my book handy, but could you flip through the book just so folks can get a sense of what it entails?
Sure. Was that for me, Bob?
Sure, Dave.
Yeah, I mean, I could run and get one, but I don't.
I think Dave's got one right there.
Yeah, he does.
It's right in my hands. So I don't know if you guys can see this okay on your screens, but what we have here is the introduction to it. And we have some of the acknowledgments for the photographs. Dave Bunnell, pleased to see him in here as well. He's filmed probably many of our show caves as well as Lake Shasta Caverns. It starts with what are speleothems, names and classifications. That was really interesting to me, Will. The difference between the way things look versus scientific ways of naming different things. Conservation, glad you put that in there. That's really important to all of us involved, of course, in show cave conservation. Minerals that form the speleothems, of course, more than just calcite. But then we get into the actual types of speleothems. And I found that really interesting. I haven't had the chance yet. I've only had this book for 2 days now, but I do plan to go through our cave at Lake Shasta Caverns and just kind of walk through. Of course, we have many of these formations, but just kind of looked at ours through the eyes of this book. For example, I never knew that there was a form of halictite called antler halictite. And so I'm going to look for some of that in our cave. And so again, I really like the comb binding. I know I mentioned that earlier, but to have the book be able to just open flat or even turned like this without breaking the binding or the spine, if you will, that's really handy. Pictures of all the formations along with their descriptions. So it really is a guide to speleothem form and identification. So very handy, very, very good, basic, but yet accessible, I think, where everyone from cavers that have been around a long time, I even gleaned a few things, and newbies, if you will, to caving, learning about Speleothem. I think it's a real good balance. So there's my plug for the book.
Hey,
Well, thank you very much.
So I have a question because I haven't counted, but Will, do you know off the top of your head how many different types of speleothems are described in the book?
Oh, boy. In the book, I didn't count them either.
Okay,
But it's a selection.
right,
I mean, anybody can name a speleothem. That was one of the points in there. It's not like naming a mineral. There's some
right.
very strict rules, and there's an international committee that has to review your proposal and all this. Anybody wants to name us, go ahead, it's free. So there's probably 100 or more speleothem names that have been bounced around at one time
Right.
or another. So I tried to pick the ones that struck me as being the most important, the most common,
Mhm.
and cover everything that's in there. And so there's probably, well, we could count them. But there was a selection. It was done deliberately, not trying to put in every speleothem name that's ever appeared in print somewhere.
No, that's good. Yeah. Well, in our remaining minutes, Will, before I formally say thank you, let's hear your favorite story. Tell us something funny or fun. Around a campfire or when you're with your friends or family, what's the story you always like to tell?
Well, okay, I'll tell you this one yet again. You've heard of Floyd Collins,
Sure.
all right, who was trapped and died in the cave down near at the outskirts of Mammoth Cave National Park about 1924, roughly. He was buried by the people who owned a private show cave, Crystal Cave, in the cave. So his coffin was sitting at a junction of two cave passages on a concrete slab with a nice granite tombstone in a limestone cave. Okay, and tourists went like, "By the cave, the show cave is closed." I said, okay. And I was doing research in there, me and another PhD student from Penn State. So there's Floyd, is still in his coffin. He's since been buried, but he's no longer in the cave. Back there he was. We're going all the way deep into the cave to go get some sort of geologic data. And it's at the bottom of a passage called the Grand Canyon, which is a really deep canyon passage. The trail comes in at the top at one end, zigzags down a dirt slope, and goes right past the coffin and on out in the lower levels of the cave. So we're chugging down there. And we hear a noise that sounds like a phone ringing from down at the bottom of the passage. Oh my gosh, okay, so we've got to find out what it is. So we go running down the trail, not very far, couple hundred feet. And on the bedrock on a piece of breakdown, right beside the coffin, is an old Army field telephone that they used to use when they were guided tours. So the guide could check in at that crossroad. So down there, and suddenly the phone rings again. It was the phone and not the coffin. But so I pick up the phone. It's an old Army field phone with a butterfly switch on it. And I listen. And I hear noises like if you're on the phone, somebody you're talking to lays their phone down to go get something. There's people in the room, you hear voices in the background, and can't quite make out what's going on, but there's noise in the phone. And so I say, "Hello, is somebody trying to call Crystal Cave?" And I hear another noise. It sounds like somebody picked up the phone. And I say again, "Hello, has anybody tried to call Crystal Cave?" There's this startled gasp at the other end of the phone, and the line goes dead.
Tell me it wasn't Floyd.
I still do not know what or how. When coming out of the cave, the phone lines ran deeper into the cave because the explorers were using them. They were just there undisturbed. Coming out, we followed the phone wires out of the cave and up the hill, the old ticket office, and halfway up the hill, there's an old telephone pole beside the trail, and there's the phone wires just hanging from the end of the pole. Not connected to anything as
Oh
far as
my
I can tell. And that's it. I don't have any idea what's going on.
That is a crazy story.
I said, hello, Floyd.
And this is when Floyd was still in the cave?
Oh, yeah, he was
Okay.
definitely there.
Okay,
Oh,
They had him in a glass top
right,
coffin,
yeah.
but the lid, they had a lid that closed, and the Park Service had chained down the lid.
Oh, okay.
But the chains had worked loose, so you could pull the lid up a little bit, take a look, and I have come face to face with Floyd Collins.
Wow. Well, at a long time ago, NCA convention hosted by Diamond Cavern, the Mammoth Cave staff took us on a tour of Crystal Cave. Floyd was long gone, but they left the rotted coffins there. And inside the door on the left, there was a pile of old coffins.
Yep.
So that
They-
was my
they-
experience there, but no Floyd.
they left the coffin in there. I wonder why they did that. You know,
Well,
I don't know.
Floyd wore out a lot of coffins.
Yep.
A lot more than most people do. As you go down to say the trail into the Grand Canyon, and part of the trail then goes up the other side and goes one way. The trail goes off to the right and goes deep into the cave. But to the left passage goes that way and ends up against the riverbank from the pile of breakdown. You can't get out that way. The old outlet for the. So you go look behind the breakdown, as Ann says, there's this jumble of old rotted coffins. They had to replace Floyd's coffins every so often, but keep him speaking for the tour.
Oh,
I think
Well,
showcase have come a long way.
talk about skeletons in the closet, right?
Yeah.
Well, Will,
I
that
think
was a
every cave
wonderful.
has a ghost story.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think so. I think, well, Matt here at Lake Shasta Caverns will tell you about our ghost. It's not in the cave, it's in the gift store.
Ooh.
But that's
Well,
a story. That's a story.
Story for another time, but yes, we got well, watch Beyond Skinwalker Ranch. We're supposed to be on an episode coming up here pretty soon.
Yeah. But Will, I want to thank you on behalf of all of us here in the NCA, and that was a great story to end our time together. It went really fast, but we're very grateful. You are our first guest on our NCA webinar series. So I want to thank you, and I want to thank you for helping me co-host this. And for all of our participants, I bid you all a good evening. Thank you, everyone,
Thank you.
Thank you, Will.
and good night.
Glad to do it.
Good night, everybody.